The train screeched to a halt in the middle of nowhere, and Elias Voss knew he'd made a terrible mistake. The woman stepping onto that frozen platform wasn't the quiet, grateful bride he'd ordered from back east. She was tall, sharp-eyed, and looked at him like she was deciding whether he was worth her time. Behind her, the Montana blizzard howled like it wanted to swallow them both whole. "You Voss?" she asked, not waiting for him to speak first. He nodded once. "Good. I'm Clara Reinhardt. Let's get one thing straight right now. I didn't come here to be owned. If you want to see how this impossible marriage survives the brutal frontier, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels." Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The advertisement had been simple, almost embarrassing in its honesty. Rancher, 34, seeks wife. Must be strong, sensible, able to endure harsh winters and isolation. Blackstone Valley, Montana Territory. No romantic notions. Hard work only. Elias had written it in 15 minutes, folded it with hands that still smelled like cattle and leather, and mailed it before he could change his mind. That was 4 months ago. 4 months of wondering if anyone would answer. 4 months of his neighbor Dutch McCain reminding him that no sane woman would travel 1,000 miles to marry a man who barely spoke. "You're going to end up with some desperate widow twice your age," Dutch had said, spitting tobacco juice into the snow. Or worse, nobody at all. But someone had answered. A woman from Philadelphia named Clara Reinhardt. Her letters were short, direct, almost businesslike. No flowery language, no declarations of longing, just questions about the ranch, the climate, what would be expected of her. Elias had appreciated that. He wasn't looking for romance. He was looking for someone who could survive. What he got was something else entirely. The train station in Helena was nothing more than a wooden platform and a ticket booth that looked ready to collapse in the next strong wind. Elias had ridden 2 days through early winter storms to get here, his horse exhausted, his coat frozen stiff against his shoulders. The telegram had been clear. Arriving December 3rd, 4 p.m. train. He was early. The wind cut across the empty platform like a blade, and snow gathered in the corners where the wood met the rails. A few other people waited, miners heading south, a family bundled in threadbare coats, an old man who might have been sleeping or dead. Nobody spoke. That was how people survived out here. You kept your head down. You didn't ask questions. When the train finally came, it didn't whistle. It just appeared through the white curtain of snow like a ghost made of iron and steam. The brakes screamed. The whole platform shook. Elias watched the doors, waiting. 3 people stepped off. A miner with a broken hand, a priest who looked lost, and then her. Clara Reinhardt. She wasn't what he'd pictured, not even close. The women who came west as mail-order brides usually looked worn down before they even arrived. Tired eyes, bent shoulders, grateful just to have a roof waiting. But this woman stood on that platform like she owned it. She was tall, maybe 5'9", with dark hair pulled back in a braid that fell past her shoulders. Her coat was wool, well-made, but not fancy. In one hand she carried a leather travel bag. In the other, a violin case. A violin. In Montana Territory. In December. Their eyes met across the platform. Hers were gray, sharp, the kind of eyes that saw through things. She didn't smile, didn't wave, just looked at him the way a rancher looks at a horse before deciding whether to buy it. Elias walked toward her, boots crunching on the frozen ground. When he stopped in front of her, he realized she was taller than most women he'd met, almost eye level with him. "You Voss?" she asked. Her voice was clear, no tremor in it despite the cold. He nodded. "Elias Voss." Clara Reinhardt. She set down her bag but kept hold of the violin case. "I assume you have a wagon." "Horse," he said. 2-day ride to the ranch." Her expression didn't change. "In this weather?" "Storm's not getting better." She looked past him at the empty white landscape beyond the platform, then back at him. "You could have mentioned that in your letters. You could have asked." For a moment something flickered in her eyes. Not anger. More like evaluation. Like she was deciding whether this was worth the trouble. Then she picked up her bag again. "Let's go then." No hesitation, no complaint. That was something, at least. The ride to the ranch was exactly as miserable as Elias expected. The snow came sideways, hard enough to sting exposed skin. The temperature dropped as soon as the sun started sinking. Clara rode behind him on the horse, her arms wrapped around his waist to keep from falling, the violin case strapped awkwardly across her back. They didn't talk. What was there to say? But Elias could feel her shivering, could feel how tightly she gripped his coat, and when they finally stopped at a shallow cave to wait out the worst of the wind, she slid off the horse without waiting for help and immediately started gathering what little dry brush she could find. "We need a fire," she said, not looking at him. "Won't last long in this wind." "Then we'll build it smart." She arranged the brush and dead wood in a tight circle, using rocks to block the wind on 3 sides. It wasn't perfect, but when Elias struck the flint and the flames caught, they held. Clara crouched close to the heat, her hands extended, her face red from cold and wind. "You do this often?" she asked after a while. "Ride through blizzards?" "Often enough." "And you wanted a wife willing to do the same." "I wanted a wife willing to survive." She glanced at him then, snow melting on her eyelashes. "You think I can't?" "Don't know yet." A ghost of a smile crossed her face, not warm, just acknowledgement. Fair enough. They reached the ranch the next afternoon. Elias had told himself not to see it through her eyes, but he couldn't help it. The cabin was small, one main room with a loft, a stone fireplace, walls chinked with moss and mud that needed replacing. The barn was bigger, sturdy, but plain. The land stretched out in every direction, white and empty and brutal. There were no neighbors within 10 miles, no town, no church, just the valley, the mountains in the distance, and the wind that never stopped. Clara stood in front of the cabin for a long time, just looking. Elias waited, holding the horse's reins, expecting disappointment, expecting her to say this wasn't what she'd agreed to. Instead, she turned to him. "Where do I sleep?" "Loft. There's a bed up there." "And you?" "Down here by the fire." She nodded slowly. "We should talk about expectations." "Now?" "Yes, now." Elias tied the horse to the post and followed her inside. The cabin was cold, the fire long dead. Clara set down her bags, took off her coat, and stood in the center of the room with her arms crossed. Even exhausted from 2 days of riding, she looked ready for a fight. "I didn't come here to be your servant," she said. "Didn't ask for one. And I'm not going to pretend to be grateful just because you paid for a train ticket. Don't need gratitude?" "Good. Then we understand each other." Elias leaned against the doorframe, studying her. Most women would have at least tried to be pleasant, would have smiled, played the part, pretended this was what they wanted. But Clara Reinhardt didn't pretend. "What do you need?" he asked. The question seemed to surprise her. She hesitated just for a second. "Honesty. No lies. If this doesn't work, I want to know before I waste years of my life. And if it does work, then we build something worth keeping." Elias didn't know what to say to that. He'd spent so many years alone, so many winters in silence, that the idea of building anything with another person felt foreign, dangerous even. But he nodded. Fair enough. Clara's first week at the ranch was a silent war. She didn't cook the way Elias expected. No quiet acceptance of his routines, no effort to please. Instead, she reorganized the entire kitchen, throwing out supplies that had gone bad, rearranging shelves, questioning why he kept certain things in certain places. "This flour is full of weevils," she said on the 3rd morning, holding up a sack. "Still good enough." "For what? Poisoning yourself?" She dumped it outside before he could argue. The same thing happened with the dried meat, half the canned goods, and a set of rusted tools he'd been meaning to fix for months. By the end of the week, the cabin looked different, cleaner, more organized. And Elias hated how much better it felt. But it wasn't just the cabin. Clara started asking questions about the ranch. How many cattle, how much land, what the winter feed situation looked like. And when Elias gave short answers, she pushed. "You have 40 head of cattle and only 2 months of hay? Been doing it this way for years. That doesn't make it smart. You know ranching now?" "I know math." Elias didn't have an answer for that, because she was right. He'd been cutting it close for years, gambling on mild winters, and every time it worked, he told himself it was fine. But Clara saw through it in less than a week. The neighbors noticed too. Dutch McCain rode over on the 8th day, ostensibly to check on the fence line, but really to get a look at the new bride. He found Clara outside, chopping wood with an axe that was too heavy for most men. "Well, I'll be damned," Dutch said, grinning. "Elias, you didn't tell me you married a lumberjack." Clara didn't stop swinging. "And you didn't tell me Montana men consider basic chores impressive." Dutch's grin faltered. He looked at Elias, who just shrugged. "She's got a mouth on her," Dutch said quietly. "Noticed." That going to be a problem? Elias watched Clara split another log clean down the middle, her form perfect, her face focused. Don't know yet. But the truth was, it already was a problem. Not because she talked back, Elias could handle that, but because every time she challenged him, every time she fixed something he'd been ignoring, every time she looked at him like he was just another obstacle to overcome, something in his chest tightened. And he didn't know if it was anger or something worse. The first real fight came 2 weeks in. Elias had planned to move the cattle to the southern pasture before the heavy snow hit. But Clara had other ideas. The southern pasture has no windbreak, she said over breakfast. You move them there, half will freeze. Done it before. And how many did you lose last year? Elias didn't answer. Because the truth was, he'd lost 6. And the year before that, 8. But admitting that felt like admitting failure, and he'd spent too many years surviving on pride to give it up now. The northern ridge has better shelter, Clara continued. It's farther, but the cattle will survive. Northern ridge is a day's ride through rough terrain, so we take 2 days. We? Clara set down her coffee cup. You think I'm staying here while you do the hard work? I'm not decoration, Elias. Never said you were. Then stop treating me like I'll break. They stared at each other across the table. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Inside, the silence stretched until it felt like wire pulled too tight. Finally, Elias stood. We leave at dawn. The ride to the northern ridge was brutal. The cattle were stubborn, the terrain steep and rocky, and the temperature dropped so low that Elias's fingers went numb even inside his gloves. But Clara kept pace. She rode like she'd been doing it for years, not weeks. When a steer broke from the herd and tried to bolt, she cut it off without hesitation, guiding it back with sharp, precise movements. Dutch had ridden along to help, and even he looked impressed. She's got instincts, he said to Elias as they crested the ridge. Most city women would have quit by now. She's not most women. That a good thing or a bad thing? Elias didn't answer, because he still didn't know. They made camp that night on the ridge. The cattle settled in the natural shelter of the rocks. Clara built the fire while Elias and Dutch secured the animals. When she finished, she sat close to the flames, her hands extended, her face lit by the orange glow. You did good today, Elias said. She glanced at him, surprised. You don't give compliments often, do you? Don't see the point in saying things people already know. Maybe people like to hear them anyway. Elias poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed for just a second, and he pulled back like he'd been burned. Clara noticed but didn't comment. You ever think about leaving? She asked after a while. The ranch? Montana, the whole thing. Elias stared into the fire. Every winter. But you stay. Don't know how to do anything else. Clara sipped her coffee slowly. I used to think I'd stay in Philadelphia forever. My family, my friends, everything I knew. But then I realized I was just existing, not living. So I answered your advertisement. Regret it? She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Elias felt something shift in the air between them. Not softness, not tenderness, just recognition. Two people who'd run out of choices and ended up here, in the middle of nowhere, trying to figure out what came next. Ask me in a year, she said. The ride back to the ranch took another full day. When they finally arrived, exhausted and frozen, Clara went straight to the loft without a word. Elias stayed downstairs, stoking the fire, listening to the sound of her moving around above him. He thought about what she'd said, about existing versus living, about regret. And for the first time in years, he wondered if maybe he'd been doing it wrong all along. Christmas came cold and unforgiving. Elias had never celebrated it, hadn't seen the point when it was just him and the cattle and the endless work. But Clara had different ideas. We need a tree, she said one morning in mid-December. A tree? For Christmas. Elias stared at her. We're in the middle of nowhere. There's no one here to see it. I'll see it. You'll see it. That's enough. So they rode out to the edge of the pine forest and cut down a small tree, maybe 6 feet tall. Clara insisted on dragging it back herself, refusing help even when the terrain got steep. When they set it up in the corner of the cabin, she stepped back and smiled. The first real smile Elias had seen from her. It's perfect, she said. It's a tree. It's Christmas. She decorated it with scraps of cloth, dried berries, and bits of tin she'd hammered into shapes. It looked ridiculous. Homemade and fragile and completely out of place in a rancher's cabin. But when she lit candles around the room and the firelight caught the decorations just right, Elias had to admit it looked warm. That night, she played the violin for the first time. She didn't ask if he wanted to hear it, just took the instrument out of its case, tuned it carefully, and began to play. The music was slow, haunting, something classical that Elias didn't recognize. It filled the cabin in a way words never could, spilling into all the empty corners, all the years of silence. When she finished, she set the violin down gently and looked at him. "My mother taught me," she said, "before she died." Elias didn't know what to say. He'd never been good with emotions, never trusted them, but something in Clara's eyes made him try. "She'd be proud," he said. Clara's expression flickered, surprise, maybe gratitude. "You don't know that?" "Yeah, I do." They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling between them. And for the first time since she'd arrived, the quiet didn't feel like distance. It felt like understanding, but understanding wasn't the same as trust. And trust took time. The test came in January, when the worst blizzard in a decade hit Blackstone Valley. Elias woke to find 3 feet of snow blocking the door and the temperature so low that ice had formed on the inside of the windows. The cattle were trapped in the northern pasture, and if they didn't get feed to them soon, they'd starve. "I'm going," Elias said, pulling on every layer he owned. Clara was already dressed. "So am I." "No." "Yes." "Clara, don't." She stepped close to him, her eyes fierce. "Don't treat me like I'm fragile. I'm going with you, and you can't stop me." Elias wanted to argue, wanted to tell her it was too dangerous, that she didn't understand how bad it could get, but he looked at her face, stubborn, determined, refusing to back down, and realized arguing was pointless. "Stay close," he said. "Don't fall behind." The ride to the northern pasture was hell. The snow was so deep the horses could barely move, and the wind cut through every layer of clothing like it wasn't there. Elias's face went numb. His hands cramped around the reins. Behind him, Clara didn't complain once, just kept riding, her head down, pushing forward. When they finally reached the pasture, half the cattle were huddled against the rocks, shivering, barely alive. The other half were scattered, disoriented, one panicked, run away from dying in the open. Elias and Clara worked in silence, spreading hay, calling the cattle back, checking each animal for frostbite or injury. It took hours. By the time they finished, the sun was already setting, and the temperature was dropping even lower. "We can't make it back tonight," Elias said. Clara nodded, her lips blue from cold. "The cave?" There was a small cave on the eastern edge of the ridge, barely big enough for 2 people and a fire, but it would keep them alive. They rode there in darkness, the horses stumbling over hidden rocks, and when they finally dismounted, Elias's legs almost gave out beneath him. Clara built the fire while he secured the horses. When the flames finally caught, they both collapsed beside it, too exhausted to speak. The cave was cramped and cold and smelled like wet stone, but it was shelter. That was all that mattered. "You still alive?" Clara asked after a while, her voice hoarse. "Barely." "Good. Me too." Elias looked at her across the fire. Her face was red and raw from the wind, her hair a tangled mess, her hands shaking even near the heat. She looked like hell, but she was still here, still fighting. "You did good today," he said. "You already said that once." "Meant it then too." Clara smiled faintly. "You're getting better at this." "At what?" "Talking to people." Elias almost laughed. Almost. Don't get used to it. They sat in silence for a long time, the fire burning low, the wind howling outside. And then, without planning it, without even thinking, Elias spoke. "I was married before." Clara's eyes snapped to him. "What?" "Long time ago. Her name was Sarah. She died in childbirth. The baby, too." The words came out flat, emotionless, because that was the only way Elias knew how to say them. But Clara didn't look away, didn't flinch, just listened. "I loved her," Elias continued. "Thought we'd have a life together, build something. But this place..." He gestured vaguely at the cave, the snow beyond. "It takes everything, and I just stopped trying." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is that why you wrote the advertisement? Because you stopped trying?" "Maybe. Or maybe I just got tired of being alone." "Which is it?" Elias looked at her, really looked at her, and realized he didn't know the answer. Didn't know if he'd wanted a companion or just someone to fill the silence. But what he did know what he couldn't deny anymore, was that Clara Reinhardt was nothing like Sarah. She didn't need him to survive, didn't need his protection or his approval. She was here because she chose to be, and that scared him more than anything. I don't know, he said finally. Clara nodded slowly. Fair enough. They made it back to the ranch the next morning, frozen and exhausted, but alive. The cattle survived. The ranch survived. And when Clara climbed up to the loft that night without a word, Elias lay by the fire and realized something had shifted between them, something he couldn't name yet but could feel, like the first crack in ice before it breaks. January bled into February. The snow didn't let up. The work didn't either. But Clara and Elias fell into a rhythm. Not easy, not smooth, but functional. She still challenged him, still questioned his decisions. But now, instead of fighting her, he listened. And sometimes he even changed his mind. The neighbors noticed. You've gone soft, Dutch said one afternoon, watching Elias fix a fence the way Clara had suggested. Smarter, maybe. That what you call it? Elias didn't answer, because the truth was complicated. He hadn't gone soft, but he had started to trust. And trust, in a place like this, was more dangerous than any blizzard. Because if Clara left, if she decided this life wasn't worth it, if she got tired of the isolation and the cold and the endless work, Elias didn't know if he could go back to being alone. And that terrified him. But Clara didn't leave. She stayed. Through the blizzards and the cattle runs and the long, silent nights. She stayed, and slowly, inch by inch, the space between them began to close. And Elias Voss, the man who'd survived years of brutal winters by keeping everyone at arm's length, started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, surviving wasn't enough anymore. Maybe it was time to start living. The first crack in their uneasy peace came in late February, when Clara found the ledger. Elias kept his records in a battered notebook tucked under a loose floorboard near his bedroll. He'd never hidden it, exactly, just never mentioned it. Numbers weren't something he liked to think about, let alone discuss. But Clara had been looking for extra nails to fix a broken shelf when the board shifted under her foot, and there it was. She pulled it out, flipped through the pages, and her face went pale. Elias. He was outside, splitting wood for the evening fire. When he came in, Clara was standing in the middle of the room with the ledger open in her hands. Where'd you find that? He asked, keeping his voice neutral. Under the floor. Were you going to tell me? Tell you what? That you're 3 months behind on the bank loan. That you owe more than this ranch is worth. That if we have one bad season, we lose everything. Elias set down the axe and wiped his hands on his pants. I've been managing. Managing? Clara's voice climbed. You call this managing? You're drowning, Elias. We're drowning. We've got time. Time for what? A miracle? He didn't answer. Because the truth was, that's exactly what he'd been counting on. A mild spring, good cattle prices, something to shift the balance before the bank came calling. It had worked before, barely, and he'd convinced himself it would work again. Clara closed the ledger with a snap. We need a plan. I have a plan. Hope isn't a plan. The words hit harder than they should have. Elias felt his jaw tighten, felt the familiar defensiveness rising in his chest. I've kept this place running for 8 years. I don't need you coming in here and what? Pointing out the truth? That you've been one bad winter away from losing everything this whole time? You don't understand how things work out here. Then explain it to me. They stared at each other across the small room. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Inside, the silence stretched like a bowstring. Finally, Elias sat down at the table. The bank in Helena holds the note, due in full by October. If I can get the cattle to market before then and prices hold, we'll make it. If not, we lose the ranch. Yes. Clara sat down across from him. Her anger had cooled, replaced by something sharper. Focus. How many head do we have? 38, lost 2 in January. And what's the market price? Last year it was $40 a head, but it fluctuates. Clara did the math in her head. That's $1,500 if we're lucky. What's the loan? Elias hesitated. $1,800. So we're short $300 minimum, and that's if everything goes perfectly. That's about right. Clara leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming on the table. Elias could see her mind working, sorting through possibilities, calculating odds. It reminded him of watching her play chess against herself in the evenings, methodical, relentless, always 3 moves ahead. We need more cattle, she said finally. Can't afford them. Then we find another way to make money. Out here? There is no other way. Clara stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered valley. There's always another way. We just have to find it. The solution came from an unexpected place. A week later, Dutch McCain rode over with news that the railroad was expanding the line through the Northern Territories. They needed timber, lots of it, and they were paying cash. It's hard work, Dutch said, warming his hands by the fire. Dangerous, too, but they're paying $3 a cord, and they need it by summer. Elias shook his head. I don't have time for logging. The cattle... I'll handle the cattle, Clara said. Both men turned to look at her. She was standing near the stove, arms crossed, her expression calm but determined. You? Dutch said, not bothering to hide his skepticism. Why not? Because you're... He stopped himself, but the word hung in the air anyway. A woman. Because I'm what? Clara's voice was ice. Dutch looked to Elias for help, but Elias just shrugged. He'd learned weeks ago that arguing with Clara Reinhardt was a losing proposition. It's hard work, Dutch said, trying a different approach. Feeding, checking fences, moving them when the snow melts. You'd be out there alone most days. I've been doing it alone for a month already. That wasn't entirely true. Elias had been helping, but Dutch didn't know that. He looked between them, clearly uncomfortable, then finally nodded. Your funeral, he muttered. After he left, Elias turned to Clara. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do. We need the money. It's not just about money. The cattle are... I know what they are. I've been watching you work them since I got here. I can handle it. Elias wanted to argue, wanted to tell her it was too much, too risky. But he looked at her face, stubborn, determined, refusing to back down, and realized she'd already made up her mind. Fine, he said, but you take the rifle. And if anything goes wrong, I'll handle it. The logging started the next week. Elias rode out before dawn to the pine forests on the eastern ridge, where the railroad had marked the trees they wanted cut. The work was brutal, swinging an axe for hours, limbing branches, cutting the trunks into manageable lengths. His hands blistered, then bled, then calloused over. His back ached so badly some nights he could barely straighten up, but the money was real. $3 a cord added up fast when you worked from sunup to sundown. By the end of the first week, Elias had earned $20. By the end of the second, $40. Meanwhile, Clara ran the ranch. She fed the cattle, checked the fences, patrolled the pastures on horseback looking for predators or strays. She worked alone, carrying the rifle Elias had insisted on, and came back each night exhausted but satisfied. Lost a steer, she said one evening, her voice flat. Elias looked up from the fire. How? Wolves. Found what was left near the creek. You see them? No, but they were close. I could hear them in the trees. Elias felt his chest tighten. You should have come back, found me. And lost the rest of the herd while I was looking for you? No, I stayed. They didn't attack again. Clara. I handled it, Elias. She said it so matter-of-factly that there was nothing left to argue about. She'd made a decision, dealt with the consequences, and moved on. It was exactly what he would have done, and that scared him more than the wolves. March came in wet and cold. The snow started to melt, turning the valley into a muddy mess. The cattle grew restless, ready for fresh grass, but still weeks away from it, and the work didn't let up. Elias kept logging, pushing himself harder as the deadline approached. The railroad needed the timber by May, and every day mattered. He worked through rain, through wind, through mornings when his muscles screamed for rest. Clara kept the ranch running, kept the cattle alive, kept them both fed with meals that were simple but solid. They barely spoke anymore. There wasn't time. Elias would leave before dawn and return after dark, too tired to do anything but eat and collapse by the fire. Clara would already be asleep in the loft, her breathing soft and steady in the darkness above him. But sometimes, on the rare nights when they were both awake, they'd sit together in the quiet and just exist in each other's presence. No words, no expectations, just two people too exhausted to pretend anymore. You ever regret it? Elias asked one night. Clara looked at him from across the fire. Regret what? Coming here. All of this. She was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes, when it's cold and I'm covered in mud and I can't remember what a hot bath feels like. But then I think about Philadelphia. About sitting in drawing rooms making small talk with people I didn't like. About being told I should be grateful for a life I hated. And I realize I'd rather be here, freezing and exhausted, than anywhere else. That's not an answer. Yes, it is. Elias studied her face in the firelight. There were new lines around her eyes, worry and work etched into her skin. Her hands were rough now, scarred from handling rope and tools. She looked nothing like the woman who'd stepped off that train in December, polished and sharp and untouchable. Now she just looked real. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly. Claire's eyes met his, surprised. "What brought that on?" "Don't know, just seemed like something you should hear." A small smile crossed her face. "You're getting sentimental in your old age." "I'm 34. Ancient." Elias almost smiled back. Almost. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be rough." Tomorrow's always rough. But she went up to the loft anyway, and Elias listened to the sound of her settling in for the night. And for the first time in weeks, he let himself imagine a future where this wasn't temporary, where Clara stayed, where they figured it out together. He fell asleep to that thought, and it followed him into his dreams. The accident happened in early April. Elias had been working on a particularly massive pine, easily 2 cords worth of timber, when the wind shifted and the tree started to fall wrong. He tried to move, tried to get clear, but his boot caught on a root and he went down hard. The trunk missed him by inches, but the recoil sent a broken branch whipping back like a spear. It caught him across the ribs, and he heard something crack. The pain was immediate and blinding. Elias gasped, tried to stand, and collapsed back to the ground. His chest felt like it was on fire. Every breath was agony. He lay there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to figure out what to do. The ranch was 5 miles away through rough terrain. His horse was tied up nearby, but mounting it seemed impossible. And Clara didn't know where he was. Wouldn't come looking until dark. Elias gritted his teeth and forced himself to his knees. The world tilted, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. But he held on, focused on breathing through the pain, and eventually managed to stand. Getting on the horse was a nightmare. He had to use a fallen log as a step, pulling himself up with his good arm while his ribs screamed in protest. Once he was mounted, he just leaned forward and let the horse find its way home. The ride back was a blur. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, clinging to the saddle, trusting the horse to keep going. When he finally saw the ranch in the distance, relief flooded through him so powerfully that he almost fell off. Clara was in the yard feeding the chickens. When she saw him slumped over the horse, she dropped the bucket and ran. "Elias!" He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She grabbed the reins, steadied the horse, then looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "What happened?" "Tree," he managed. "Ribs." She didn't waste time asking questions, just helped him down from the horse, half carrying him into the cabin and onto his bedroll. Elias collapsed with a groan, every movement sending fresh waves of pain through his chest. Clara knelt beside him, her hands already working to unbutton his shirt. "How bad?" "Don't know. Can't breathe right." She pulled his shirt open carefully, and Elias heard her sharp intake of breath. He didn't need to look to know it was bad. The pain told him everything. "Your ribs are broken," Claire said, her voice tight. "At least 2, maybe 3. Can you fix it?" "I'm not a doctor." "Clara, I know." She stood up, pacing for a moment, then stopped and looked at him. "I need to bind your chest. Keep the ribs stable. It's going to hurt." "Everything already hurts." She almost smiled at that. Almost. Then she gathered strips of cloth and a bottle of whiskey from the shelf. "Drink this first." Elias took the bottle and swallowed 3 long pulls. The whiskey burned going down, but it took the edge off the pain just enough to make breathing possible. Clara worked quickly and efficiently, wrapping the cloth tightly around his torso. Every time she pulled the binding tighter, Elias had to bite down on his tongue to keep from crying out. But he didn't tell her to stop. He trusted her. When she finally finished, she sat back on her heels, breathing hard. "You need rest, and you need to stop working." "Can't." "Elias, we need the money. Railroad deadline is in 3 weeks." "The money doesn't matter if you're dead. We lose the ranch if I don't finish." Claire's jaw tightened. "Then I'll finish it." Elias stared at her. "You can't log. It's too dangerous." "And what you were doing wasn't?" "That's different." "How?" He didn't have a good answer for that, because it wasn't different. The work was dangerous no matter who did it. But the idea of Clara out there, swinging an axe, risking the same injury, or worse, made his chest tighten even more than the broken ribs. "Just rest for now," Clara said, standing up. "We'll figure it out." But Elias knew there was nothing to figure out. They needed the money, which meant the logging had to continue. And if he couldn't do it, then Clara would, whether he liked it or not. The next morning, Clara left before dawn. Elias tried to get up, tried to stop her, but the pain in his ribs made it impossible. He heard the door close, heard her horse ride away, and then he was alone with nothing but the fire and his own useless anger. She came back that evening covered in dirt and wood chips, her hands blistered, her face drawn with exhaustion. She didn't say anything, just set down the axe, started dinner, and kept moving until the work was done. "How much did you cut?" Elias asked from his bedroll. "Half a cord?" "That's not enough." "It's what I could manage." Elias wanted to argue, wanted to tell her to stop, but he could see the determination in her eyes. She'd made up her mind, and nothing he said would change it, so he watched helplessly as she went out every day, working herself to exhaustion while he lay useless on the floor. His ribs healed slowly, too slowly, and the frustration of being stuck in the cabin while Clara did everything gnawed at him like a wound that wouldn't close. "You're going to kill yourself," he said one night. Clara looked up from the fire, her face shadowed. "No, I'm not. You can't keep this pace. Watch me." "Clara." "Stop, Elias!" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "You don't get to lie there and tell me what I can't do. I'm handling it. The cattle are fine, the logging is getting done, we're going to make it." "And what happens when you get hurt?" "I won't. You don't know that." "Neither did you." The words hung between them, heavy and unanswerable. Elias looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone who'd reached the edge of her limits but refused to acknowledge it. Someone who'd rather burn out than give up. It reminded him of himself, and that terrified him. 2 weeks before the railroad deadline, Dutch McCain showed up unannounced. He found Clara in the yard, sharpening the axe blade with a whetstone, and Elias inside trying to stand without his ribs screaming. "Heard you got yourself banged up," Dutch said, helping Elias to a chair. "Word travels fast." "Small valley, people talk." He glanced toward the door where Clara was still working. "She's been doing the logging?" "Yeah." Dutch whistled low. "She's tougher than I gave her credit for." "Tougher than me, probably." "Won't argue with that." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Dutch said, "I came to help." Elias looked at him, surprised. "What?" "With the logging. You need it done, and I've got time. Figure I'll lend a hand." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to, but your wife's out there killing herself, and you're in here doing the same. Someone needs to have some sense." Elias didn't know what to say. Dutch wasn't the type to offer help. Most ranchers out here kept to themselves, survived on pride and stubbornness. But maybe the valley was different than Elias thought. Maybe people cared more than they let on. "Thank you," he said finally. Dutch waved him off. "Don't mention it. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "When you're healed up, you pay it forward. Someone else needs help, you show up." "Deal." Dutch rode out to the logging site with Clara the next morning, and Elias was left alone again. But this time, the helplessness felt different, less like failure, more like trust. He trusted Dutch to work hard, trusted Clara to stay safe, and for once, he let himself believe that maybe they'd actually pull this off. The timber got delivered to the railroad on time. Barely. Dutch and Clara worked 16-hour days for 2 weeks straight, cutting and hauling until their hands were raw and their backs were screaming. When the last cord was loaded onto the wagon and the railroad foreman counted out the payment in cash, Clara just stood there holding the money like she couldn't quite believe it was real. "We did it," she said quietly. Dutch grinned. "Damn right we did." They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon light, exhausted but victorious. When they arrived, Elias was standing in the yard, actually standing, for the first time in 3 weeks. His ribs still hurt, but he'd managed to get up and move around without collapsing. Clara dismounted and walked straight to him. For a moment, Elias thought she might hug him, but instead, she just handed him the money. $800, she said. "That should cover what we need." Elias looked down at the bills in his hand, then up at her face. She looked like hell, dirty, exhausted, barely holding herself upright, but her eyes were bright with something he hadn't seen before. Pride, maybe. Or hope. "You did this," he said. "We did this." "No, you did." Clara shook her head. "You started it. I just finished." They stood there in the fading light, Dutch watching from his horse with a knowing smile, and for the first time since the accident, Elias let himself feel something other than frustration. Gratitude, relief, and something deeper. Something he wasn't ready to name yet, but could feel growing in his chest like warmth after a long winter. "Thank you," he said. Clara smiled, tired but real. "You're welcome." That night, after Dutch had ridden home and the chores were done, Elias and Clara sat by the fire together. Neither of them spoke much. They were too tired for conversation, but the silence felt different now. Less like distance, more like companionship. "We still have to get the cattle to market," Clara said eventually. "October's not that far away." "I know. Think we can do it?" Elias looked at her across the fire. Weeks ago, he would have said no. Would have listed all the ways it could go wrong, all the reasons they'd fail. But now, after everything they'd survived, he found himself nodding. "Yeah," he said. "I think we can." Clara leaned back against the wall, her eyes already closing. "Good. Because I didn't come this far to lose." "Me neither." She fell asleep sitting up, her head tilted against the log wall, her breathing slow and even. Elias watched her for a long time. This woman who'd crossed half a continent to marry a stranger, who'd fought him at every turn, who'd saved his ranch and maybe his life without asking for anything in return. And he realized, somewhere between the logging and the accident and the money in his hand, she'd stopped being a stranger. She'd become something else, something more. He just didn't know what to do about it yet. Spring came late to Blackstone Valley, dragging its feet like it couldn't decide whether to commit. The snow melted in patches, leaving the ground half frozen and slick with mud. The cattle grew restless, pawing at the earth looking for green grass that wasn't there yet. And the wind, always the wind, kept blowing cold enough to remind everyone that winter hadn't quite finished with them. Elias's ribs healed slowly. By late April, he could move without wincing, could swing an axe for short bursts, could ride without feeling like his chest might split open. But Clara wouldn't let him push it. "You're not logging anymore," she'd said one morning when he mentioned going back to the timber site. "We could use the extra money." "We have enough. And you need to be able to work the cattle drive in October. That means not breaking yourself again." She'd said it with that tone that left no room for argument, so Elias had let it go. Besides, she was right. The cattle drive would be brutal. Weeks of moving livestock across rough terrain, dealing with unpredictable weather and even less predictable buyers. If his ribs weren't fully healed by then, they'd be in trouble. So instead, he focused on fixing everything that had fallen apart while he was injured. Fences that needed mending, tools that needed sharpening, the barn roof that had started leaking during the March rains. Small jobs, manageable jobs, the kind of work that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far into dangerous territory. Because the truth was, something had shifted between him and Clara, something he couldn't name and didn't know how to handle. It wasn't just gratitude for what she'd done, though he felt plenty of that. It was something deeper, more complicated. The kind of thing that made him catch himself watching her when she wasn't looking, noticing the way she moved, the way her face changed when she concentrated on something difficult. He didn't like it, didn't trust it. Feelings like that got people hurt, and Elias had spent years building walls specifically to avoid that kind of hurt. But the walls were cracking, and he didn't know how to stop it. Clara, for her part, seemed oblivious. Or maybe she just didn't care. She went about her days with the same focused efficiency she'd always had, working the ranch like she'd been born to it. The cattle trusted her now, responded to her voice, followed her lead without hesitation. Even the neighbors had stopped questioning her ability. She'd earned their respect the hard way, through work and stubbornness and refusing to quit. "Your wife's something else," a rancher named Tom Berkeley had said to Elias at the general store in town. "My Sarah saw her bring in a stray calf through a thunderstorm last week, said she didn't even flinch when the lightning hit." Elias had just nodded, unsure what to say. Yeah, that sounded like Clara. The first real warning came in mid-May. Dutch rode over looking grim, his horse lathered and breathing hard like he'd pushed it too fast. "We got a problem," he said, dismounting in a hurry. Elias set down the fence post he'd been working on. "What kind of problem?" "The Baxter brothers." Clara came out of the barn, wiping her hands on her pants. "Who?" "Ranchers from the North Valley," Elias explained. "They've been trying to expand their territory for years." Dutch nodded. "They filed a claim with the land office. says your northern pasture is actually unclaimed federal land, and they're staking it. That's a lie, Elias said flatly. I've had those papers filed for 6 years. I know, but they're saying the original survey was wrong, that your boundary markers are off by half a mile. Clara crossed her arms. And the land office is just believing them? They're sending someone out to resurvey. Could take months. Meanwhile, the Baxters are moving their cattle onto the disputed land. Elias felt his jaw tighten. The northern pasture was where they'd moved the herd for the summer. Good grass, natural shelter, close enough to check on daily. Losing it would mean moving the cattle somewhere else, somewhere worse, and risking them right before the October drive. We moved them off, Elias said. Can't, Dutch replied. Not legally. If you touch their cattle before the survey's done, they can claim you're interfering with the legitimate land claim. Could get the sheriff involved. So we just let them steal our land? For now, yeah. Unless you want to start a range war. Clara looked between them. There has to be another option. Not a legal one, Dutch said. The Baxters have been planning this for a while. They know the loopholes, know how to work the system. Elias turned away, his hands clenched into fists. He'd dealt with men like the Baxters before. The kind who took what they wanted and hid behind paperwork and lawyers. Fighting them head-on usually ended badly, but doing nothing felt like surrender. What do you suggest? He asked Dutch. Move your cattle, find different pasture, avoid the whole mess until the survey's done and you can prove the land's yours. And if the survey takes 6 months? A year? Dutch didn't have an answer for that. After he left, Clara and Elias stood in the yard staring at the northern hills in the distance. The pasture they'd worked so hard to secure, the land they'd nearly killed themselves protecting. And now someone else was just taking it. We can't move the cattle, Clara said quietly. There's nowhere better to put them. I know. So what do we do? Elias thought about it. Thought about the Baxters and their schemes, about the land office and their bureaucracy, about everything that could go wrong if they fought back. Then he thought about what Clara had taught him over the past 6 months, that sometimes the smart play wasn't the aggressive one. We document everything, he said. Take photographs of the boundary markers. Get witness statements from neighbors who know where the property line is. Build a case so solid the land office can't ignore it. That could take weeks. Better than losing a fight we can't win. Clara studied his face, surprised. You're not going to confront them. No point. They want me to lose my temper, do something stupid, give them ammunition. He met her eyes. You taught me that. Think first. Act second. A small smile crossed her face. You were listening. Sometimes. They spent the next 2 weeks gathering evidence. Elias rode to Helena and filed a formal dispute with the land office. Clara interviewed neighbors, got signed statements about where the property lines had always been. They hired a photographer from town to document the boundary markers, the fence lines, everything that proved the northern pasture belonged to them. The Baxters didn't make it easy. Their cattle kept wandering onto Elias's land, trampling grass, muddying water sources. And the brothers themselves, Jack and Coleman Baxter, started showing up at the ranch, ostensibly to check on their new property, but really to intimidate. Jack was the older one, mid-40s, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that missed nothing. Coleman was younger, meaner, the type who enjoyed conflict for its own sake. They rode up to the cabin one afternoon while Clara was outside working on the garden she'd started. You must be the Eastern bride, Jack said, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness. Heard Voss ordered himself a wife. Didn't expect someone so refined. Clara straightened up, trowel in hand. And you are? Jack Baxter. This is my brother Coleman. We own the land north of here. You mean the land you're trying to steal? Coleman laughed, sharp and ugly. Steal? That's federal land, darling. We're just claiming what's ours. The survey will prove otherwise. Survey takes time, Jack said easily. And we've got patience. Question is, do you? Clara set down the trowel and walked closer. She was tall enough to look Jack nearly level in the eye, and she didn't flinch when Coleman's horse stamped nervously. We have plenty of patience and plenty of evidence. So unless you want to waste your time and money on a claim you'll lose, I'd suggest you move your cattle back to your actual property. Jack's smile didn't reach his eyes. That a threat? It's advice. Take it or don't. For a moment, tension crackled between them like static before a storm. Then Jack tipped his hat again. We'll see what the land office says. Enjoy your garden, Mrs. Voss. They rode off, and Clara stood watching until they disappeared over the hill. When she turned around, Elias was standing in the doorway of the cabin. "You handled that well," he said. "They'll be back." "I know. And next time they might not be so polite." Elias walked out to stand beside her. "Then we'll handle it, together." Clara looked at him, something shifting in her expression. "You mean that?" "Yeah, I do." She nodded slowly, and for the first time since the Baxters had shown up, Elias saw relief in her eyes. Not fear, not doubt, just relief that she wasn't fighting this alone. June came in hot and dry. The spring rain stopped almost overnight, and the valley turned brown and brittle under a relentless sun. The creeks began to shrink, the grass in the pastures withered, and everyone started watching the sky, hoping for clouds that never came. "It's going to be a bad summer," Dutch said one evening, stopping by to check on things. "Drought's already hitting the southern ranches, lost 3 wells last week. Ours is still holding," Elias said, "but the water table's dropping. You might want to dig a backup, just in case." They spent 3 days digging a new well near the barn, taking turns with the shovel and pickaxe, going down 20 feet before they hit water. It was hard, miserable work, made worse by the heat and the mosquitoes that swarmed the moment the sun started setting. But when water finally began pooling at the bottom of the hole, Clara actually cheered. "We did it," she said, grinning despite being covered in mud. "Don't celebrate yet," Elias replied. "We still have to line it and build a pump." "Let me have this." He almost smiled. "Fine. We did it." They finished the well by mid-June, and just in time. The main well started running dry in early July, the water flow slowing to a trickle. If they hadn't dug the backup, the cattle would have been in serious trouble. But water wasn't their only problem. The drought brought something worse. It started as a rumor. A rancher 2 valleys over mentioned seeing smoke in the hills. Then another reported a small brush fire that burned itself out overnight. Nothing serious, nothing to worry about. But Elias had lived through enough Montana summers to know that small fires didn't stay small when everything was this dry. "We need to clear the brush around the buildings," he told Clara one morning. "Create a fire break." "You think it'll get that bad?" "Hope not, but I'd rather be ready." They spent the next week cutting back dead grass and clearing brush in a wide circle around the cabin and barn. It was tedious, exhausting work, and more than once Clara stopped to ask if it was really necessary. "Look at the hills," Elias said, pointing to the brown landscape. "Everything's dead, one spark, and it all goes up." Clara followed his gaze and didn't argue again. The fire came on July 18th in the middle of the night. Elias woke to the smell of smoke, sat up fast, and knew immediately that something was wrong. He climbed out of his bedroll and went to the window. In the distance, maybe 5 miles north, an orange glow lit up the horizon. "Clara!" he called up to the loft. "Wake up." She appeared at the edge of the loft, already alert. "What is it?" "Fire. Northern Hills." She was down the ladder in seconds, pulling on her boots. "How big?" "Can't tell from here. But it's moving." They went outside together. The night was hot, windless, the air thick with smoke even from this distance. The glow in the north was growing, spreading along the ridge like someone had drawn a line of flame across the darkness. "That's heading toward town," Claire said. "And the valley. Everyone's in the path." By dawn, half the valley had gathered at the crossroads near Blackstone's only church. Families stood in clusters, watching the smoke rise in the distance, arguing about what to do. Some wanted to evacuate. Others wanted to fight. Most just looked scared. Dutch found Elias and Clara near the edge of the crowd. "It's bad," he said. "Started from a lightning strike up on Copper Ridge. Wind picked up around midnight and pushed it south. Now it's moving toward the valley on 3 fronts. "How much time do we have?" Elias asked. "Day, maybe 2 if the wind shifts, but if it keeps coming like this—" Dutch didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Tom Berkeley pushed through the crowd, his face red with panic. "We need to evacuate. Get everyone to Helena before the roads are cut off." "And leave our homes?" a woman shouted. "Our ranches? Better than dying." The argument escalated fast, voices rising, people shouting over each other. Elias watched it spiral, watched fear turn into chaos, and realized nobody was actually in charge. Nobody knew what to do. Then Clara stepped forward. "Listen to me," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. People turned, surprised. Some looked annoyed that a woman, an Eastern woman at that, was interrupting, But Clara didn't back down. Running won't help, she continued. The roads are already compromised. We'd be trapping ourselves. But we can't just wait either. So what do you suggest? Jack Baxter called from the back, his tone mocking. You got some magic solution? Fire breaks, Clara said. The crowd went quiet. We burned sections of our own land, she explained. Controlled burns to create barriers the wildfire can't cross. It's a technique used in Europe, especially in farming regions. If we do it right, we can stop the fire before it reaches the valley. That's insane, someone said. It'll destroy everything anyway, another added. No, Clara said firmly. A controlled burn is planned, managed. We choose what burns and what doesn't. The wildfire will take everything. Tom Berkeley shook his head. And if you're wrong, if the fire spreads faster than you think, then we're no worse off than we are now. Jack Baxter pushed forward. This is your plan? Burn our own land on the word of some city woman who doesn't know a damn thing about wildfires. Clara turned to face him. I know fire moves faster uphill, slower downhill. I know it needs fuel to survive. And I know that doing nothing guarantees we lose everything. So unless you have a better idea, I suggest you either help or get out of the way. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. People looked at each other, uncertain, scared, and then Elias stepped up beside Clara. She's right, he said. I've seen wildfires burn entire homesteads in hours. We can't outrun this, but we can control where it goes. Dutch nodded slowly. I'm in. One by one, others agreed. Not everyone. Jack Baxter and a few others refused, called it suicide. But enough. Enough to make it work. They spent the rest of the day organizing. Clara drew up a map of the valley, marking where the fire break should go based on wind patterns and terrain. Elias and Dutch led teams to clear brush and dig trenches. Families packed valuables, moved livestock to safer pastures, prepared for the worst. By nightfall, they were ready. The wildfire was less than 3 miles away now, a wall of flame taller than any building in the valley, consuming everything in its path. The smoke was so thick it blotted out the stars. The heat could be felt even from this distance. Clara stood at the edge of the first fire break, holding a torch. Elias stood beside her. You sure about this? He asked. No, she admitted, but it's the best chance we have. If this goes wrong, it won't. Elias looked at her face, lit by the flickering torch, and saw no doubt there, just determination. And he realized in that moment that he trusted her completely, more than he'd ever trusted anyone. All right, he said. Let's do it. Clara lowered the torch to the dry grass, and the fire caught instantly. It spread fast, racing along the line they'd prepared, burning hot and bright but controlled. People watched from a safe distance, holding their breath, waiting to see if Clara's plan would work, or if they'd just made everything worse. The fire break burned for hours. They lit 3 more throughout the night, creating a barrier of scorched earth between the valley and the wildfire. It was terrifying work, standing so close to the flames, feeling the heat, knowing one wrong move could turn everything into an inferno. But Clara directed them with calm precision, adjusting the burns based on wind shifts, making sure nothing got out of control. By dawn, they were exhausted and covered in soot, but the fire breaks were complete. All they could do now was wait. The wildfire reached the valley around noon the next day. It came down the northern ridge like an avalanche of flame, consuming trees and brush and everything in its path. People watched from the town, silent, terrified, as the wall of fire approached the first fire break. And then it stopped. The flames hit the scorched earth and had nothing left to burn. They flickered, tried to jump the gap, but there was no fuel. Slowly, section by section, the wildfire began to die. The valley was saved. People stood in stunned silence, unable to believe what they were seeing. The fire that should have destroyed everything had been stopped by the very thing everyone thought was crazy. Tom Berkeley turned to Clara, his eyes wide. You did it. You actually did it. Clara just nodded, too tired to speak. Elias put a hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into him slightly, just for a moment, before straightening up again. We all did it, she said. Everyone who helped. But people weren't looking at everyone. They were looking at her. The woman who'd come from the east and saved Blackstone Valley from destruction. Jack Baxter stood at the edge of the crowd, his face dark with something that might have been respect or might have been resentment. Then he turned and walked away without a word. The celebration was quiet and exhausted. People drifted back to their homes, checked their property, counted their blessings. A few ranches on the outer edges had been damaged, but nothing catastrophic. The valley had survived. Elias and Clara rode back to their ranch in silence. When they arrived, they just stood in the yard for a long time, looking at the cabin, the barn, the land they'd fought so hard to protect. "Thank you," Elias said finally. Clara looked at him, surprised. For what? For not giving up. For knowing what to do when nobody else did. "I didn't know. I just guessed." "It was a good guess." She smiled faintly. "Yeah, it was." They went inside, washed the soot from their faces and hands, and collapsed by the fire even though it was still warm outside. Neither of them had the energy to talk, to process what had just happened. They just sat there side by side, letting the silence settle around them. After a while, Clara spoke. "You trusted me." "Yeah." "Why?" Elias thought about it. Thought about all the reasons he shouldn't have. Her inexperience, the risk, the fact that the entire valley could have burned because of one wrong decision. But none of that mattered as much as the simple truth. "Because you've been right about everything else," he said. Clara looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted, softened. "I'm not always right." "Close enough." She almost laughed. Almost. Then she leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. "We still have to deal with the Baxters." "I know. And the cattle drive in October." "I know. And the bank." "I know, Clara." She opened one eye. "Just making sure you're paying attention. Hard not to with you around." This time she did laugh, soft and tired, and Elias found himself smiling despite everything, the exhaustion, the stress, the constant fight to survive. Because somehow, in the middle of all this chaos, he'd found something he hadn't expected. He'd found a partner. The letter from the land office arrived 3 weeks after the fire. Elias found it stuck in the door when he came back from checking the southern fence line, the paper already warped from afternoon heat. He opened it, standing in the yard, Clara watching from where she was mending a saddle strap. "What is it?" she asked. Elias scanned the official language, the bureaucratic nonsense that took 2 pages to say what could have been said in 2 sentences. Then he looked up. "Survey's complete. Northern pasture is ours. Baxter's claim has been denied." Clara set down the saddle. "They're sure?" "Says here the original boundary markers were accurate. Baxter's knowingly filed a false claim." He folded the letter. "We won." He expected relief, maybe satisfaction, but what he felt was just tired. Tired of fighting, tired of proving himself, tired of the constant scramble to keep everything from falling apart. Winning felt less like victory and more like just another day survived. Clara walked over and took the letter from his hands, reading it herself. "The Baxters won't take this well." "Probably not." "You think they'll cause trouble?" "They already have. Question is how much more." As if on cue, Dutch rode up 2 days later with news that the Baxters had filed an appeal. It would take months to process, and in the meantime, the land remained Elias's, but the legal fight wasn't over. "They're just being vindictive now," Dutch said. "They know they lost. They're dragging it out to cost you money." "Let them," Clara said. "We have the documentation. They have nothing but spite." Dutch looked at her with something like admiration. "You don't rattle easy, do you?" "Not anymore." After he left, Elias found Clara in the barn, brushing down the horses with more force than necessary. He leaned against the stall door, watching her work. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine." "You're brushing that horse like it owes you money." Clara stopped, the brush suspended in midair. Then she set it down and turned to face him. "I'm angry. At the Baxters. At everything. The fire, the land dispute, the constant fight just to exist out here. I thought—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "Never mind." "Thought what?" "I thought it would get easier. That once we got through the hard part, things would settle. But it doesn't, does it? It's just hard, all the time, forever." Elias moved into the stall, standing close enough to see the frustration in her eyes. "Yeah, that's about right." "Then why do you stay?" It was the same question she'd asked months ago, but this time it carried more weight. Because now she knew, now she'd lived it, and Elias owed her an honest answer. "Because leaving means admitting I wasted 8 years of my life on something that didn't matter," he said. "And I'm too stubborn to do that." "That's a terrible reason." "I know." Clara studied his face. Is that really why? Or is there something else? Elias thought about Sarah, about the life he'd planned and lost, about all the years he'd spent trying to rebuild something from nothing. But standing here with Clara, covered in dust and horsehair and frustration, he realized the truth was simpler than all that. I stay because I don't know how to do anything else, he said. This is who I am, for better or worse. And if it's worse, then at least I was myself when everything fell apart. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up the brush again. That's still a terrible reason. You have a better one? No, that's the problem. They worked in silence after that, but it felt different than the usual quiet. Less comfortable, more fragile, like something between them had shifted and neither of them knew how to shift it back. August came in brutal. The drought continued, the wells dropped lower, and the grass in the pastures turned brown and brittle despite their best efforts. The cattle grew lean, restless, harder to manage. And the heat, the relentless, suffocating heat, made everything worse. Elias started waking up before dawn, just to get work done before the temperature became unbearable. Clara did the same. They'd pass each other in the pre-dawn darkness, exchange a nod, then head off in different directions to tackle separate chores. By midday, they'd retreat to the cabin, too hot to function, and sit in silence drinking water that was never cold enough. We need rain, Clara said one afternoon, staring out the window at the cloudless sky. Won't get it, not until September at the earliest. The cattle can't wait that long. I know. Clara turned from the window. We need to move them to higher elevation, where there's still water. That means the mountain pastures, 2 days' drive minimum. Better than watching them die of thirst. Elias knew she was right. The mountain pastures had natural springs that rarely dried up, protected by tree cover and higher elevation. But getting the cattle there meant navigating rough terrain, crossing a river that could be unpredictable even in drought conditions, and leaving the ranch unattended for nearly a week. We do it together, he said. Both of us. We can't split up for this. Clara nodded. When? Tomorrow, before it gets any worse. They left at first light, driving 38 head of cattle north toward the mountains. The journey was every bit as difficult as Elias had feared. The cattle were sluggish from heat and hunger, reluctant to move. The terrain was rocky, steep in places, hard on both animals and riders. And the river crossing turned into a 2-hour ordeal when half the herd balked at the water. Move! Clara shouted, pushing a stubborn steer toward the bank. You want water? This is water! The steer just stood there, wide-eyed and stupid. Elias rode up beside her. They're spooked by the current, he said. Then we lead them across. You go first. Elias guided his horse into the river. The water was lower than he'd expected, but still moving fast, cold from mountain runoff. He made it halfway across before looking back. Claire had already started moving the first group of cattle toward the water. Slow, he called. Don't rush them. I know what I'm doing. But one of the steers panicked anyway, tried to turn back, and knocked into another animal. Within seconds, half a dozen cattle were milling in confusion at the water's edge. Clara's horse danced nervously, and for a moment Elias thought she might lose control. But she held firm, voice steady and commanding, gradually getting the animals sorted and moving forward. By the time the entire herd was across, they were both soaked and exhausted. But the mountain pastures were close now, maybe another hour's drive. They pushed on. The pastures were exactly what they needed: green grass, clear water, shade from pine trees that still held their needles despite the drought. The cattle spread out immediately, drinking deep, already looking more settled. Elias and Clara made camp near the spring, too tired to ride back the same day. We'll stay tonight, Elias said. Head back tomorrow. Clara nodded, already gathering wood for a fire. They worked in practiced silence, setting up camp, preparing a simple meal of salt pork and beans. When the fire was burning steady, they sat on opposite sides and ate without talking. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was beautiful in a harsh, indifferent way. The kind of beauty that didn't care whether you appreciated it or not. You ever think about leaving? Clara asked suddenly. Elias looked at her across the fire. The ranch? Montana. All of it. Just walking away. Every day. What stops you? He thought about it. Pride, mostly. The idea that if I leave, it means I failed. That Sarah died for nothing. That the last 8 years were just wasted time. Clara poked at the fire with a stick. Sarah was your first wife. Yeah. You loved her. It wasn't a question, but Elias answered anyway. I did. Do you still? The question caught him off guard. He started to give an easy answer, something simple and safe. But Clara deserved better than that. I loved who she was, he said carefully, and I loved the life we were supposed to have. But she's been gone 6 years, and holding on to that, it doesn't help anything. Doesn't bring her back, just keeps me stuck. Are you still stuck? Elias met her eyes across the fire. Less than I was. Clara nodded slowly, like that made sense. I was engaged once, back in Philadelphia. This was new. She'd never mentioned it before. Elias waited. His name was William. Merchant family, good prospects, everything my parents wanted for me. We were supposed to marry in the spring. She paused. I called it off 3 months before the wedding. Why? Because I realized I'd rather be miserable alone than miserable with someone who wanted me to be something I'm not. He wanted a wife who'd host dinner parties and manage servants and smile at his business partners. Someone decorative, useful in the right social context, but otherwise invisible. That doesn't sound like you. It isn't, but I tried for almost 2 years to convince myself it could be, that I could make it work. She shook her head. When I finally admitted I couldn't, my family stopped speaking to me. Said I'd ruined my prospects, embarrassed them, thrown away a good life out of stubbornness. Is that why you answered my advertisement? Partly. Also because I had nothing left to lose, figured Montana couldn't be worse than Philadelphia. And? Clara smiled faintly. It's different, but not worse. They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling between them. Elias thought about what she'd said, about choosing to be miserable alone rather than miserable with the wrong person. It made him realize something he'd been avoiding for months. He wasn't miserable anymore. Hadn't been for a while. And it was because of her. Clara, he said quietly. She looked up. I'm glad you came here. Her expression shifted, surprise maybe, or something softer. Yeah? Yeah. Even though I argue with everything you say? Especially because of that. Clara laughed, a real laugh, and the sound of it did something to Elias's chest, made it feel tight and warm at the same time. You're getting sentimental again, she said. Can't help it. Must be the mountain air. Must be. They rode back to the ranch the next day, taking their time, letting the horses set the pace. When they arrived, the cabin felt emptier than usual, too quiet, too big for just the two of them moving around in separate orbits. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He lay by the fire, staring at the ceiling, listening to Clara move around in the loft above him. He kept replaying their conversation by the campfire, kept thinking about the way she'd looked at him when he said he was glad she'd come. He was falling in love with her. Had probably been falling for months without realizing it, and the thought terrified him more than any fire or drought or legal battle ever could, because loving someone meant risking loss, meant opening himself up to the kind of pain he'd spent years trying to avoid. And Elias didn't know if he was strong enough to survive that again. But lying there in the dark, he also realized he might not have a choice. The feeling was already there, had already taken root, and pretending otherwise was just delaying the inevitable. The question was what to do about it. September arrived with cooler temperatures and finally, rain. Not enough to break the drought, but enough to green up the pastures and refill the creeks. The cattle started putting on weight again. The tension that had gripped the valley all summer began to ease. The land dispute with the Baxters quietly resolved itself when their appeal was denied and the legal fees started piling up. They withdrew their claim and went back to their own ranch, bitter but beaten. Elias felt no satisfaction in their defeat, just relief that it was over. With October approaching fast, he and Clara turned their attention to preparing for the cattle drive. It would be their last chance to make the money they needed to pay off the bank loan. Everything depended on it. We need to get $40 a head minimum, Elias said one evening, reviewing their finances. Anything less and we're short. What's the market been running? Last I heard, 35 to 45 depending on quality, but prices can shift fast. Clara frowned. That's cutting it close. I know. What if we don't make it? What if prices drop or we lose cattle on the drive? Then we lose the ranch. The words hung heavy in the air. They'd worked so hard, survived so much, and it all came down to this one drive. One roll of the dice. Elias hated how much was riding on factors beyond their control. We'll make it, Clara said firmly. We've made it through everything else. This is different. How? Because if we fail, there's no coming back from it. No second chance. Clara reached across the table and put her hand on his. The touch was unexpected, warm, solid. Then we don't fail. Elias looked down at her hand covering his. She'd never touched him like this before. Deliberately, intimately. It felt like crossing a line they'd been dancing around for months. Clara, I mean it, she said. We've survived too much to quit now. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. What if it's not enough? What if we do everything right and still lose? Then at least we tried, together. The word hit him harder than it should have. Together. Like they were actually a team, a partnership, maybe even more than that. I don't want to lose this, he said quietly. The ranch, yeah. But also, this, whatever this is. Clara's eyes searched his face. What is this? Elias had never been good with words, never trusted his ability to say what he meant. But looking at Clara now, her hand in his, he knew he had to try. I think it's me realizing I don't want to do this alone anymore. Not just the ranch, everything. He stopped, struggling for the right words. I want you to stay. Not because of some agreement or because you don't have anywhere else to go, but because you want to. Elias, I know we didn't start this as a real marriage, and I know I'm not easy to live with, but somewhere along the way, things changed. At least for me. He took a breath. I'm in love with you, Clara. And if that's not what you want, if that's not why you're here, then tell me now, before I make this worse. The silence that followed felt endless. Clara stared at him, her expression unreadable, and Elias felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd said too much, pushed too hard, ruined everything. Then Clara laughed. Not mockery, not disbelief, just a soft, surprised laugh that made her whole face change. You're terrible at timing, she said. What? I've been waiting for you to say something for months, and you choose now? 2 weeks before the most important cattle drive of our lives? Elias blinked. What? Claire stood up, came around the table, and before he could process what was happening, she kissed him. It was nothing like the formal kiss at their wedding ceremony, brief, obligatory, witnessed by a bored clerk at the land office. This was real, warm and fierce, and full of months of pent-up frustration and want. Elias froze for half a second, then kissed her back, his hands coming up to her waist, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara rested her forehead against his. I'm in love with you too, you stubborn fool, she said. Have been since you trusted me with the fire breaks. Maybe longer. Why didn't you say anything? Because you needed to figure it out yourself. I wasn't going to push you into something you weren't ready for. Elias laughed, a real laugh, and it felt like something breaking open in his chest. I'm ready now. Good, because I'm not going anywhere. They kissed again, slower this time, and Elias felt years of loneliness and grief start to crack and fall away. This wasn't the life he'd planned, wasn't the future he'd imagined. But standing here with Clara in his arms, he realized it was better, more real, more true. We should probably get some sleep, Clara said eventually, though she made no move to pull away. Big day tomorrow. Probably. Are you going to let me go? Eventually. She smiled against his mouth. Good. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the firelight, the world outside forgotten. And for the first time since Sarah died, Elias let himself believe in a future worth fighting for. The weeks leading up to the cattle drive passed in a blur of preparation and stolen moments. They worked during the day like always, checking the herd, mending equipment, planning the route to market. But at night, things were different. They'd sit closer by the fire, Clara leaning against Elias's shoulder, his arm around her waist. Sometimes they'd talk about the drive, about what came after. Other times they'd just exist together in comfortable silence. Dutch noticed the change immediately. You two finally figure it out? He asked Elias one afternoon. Figure what out? That you're actually married. I was starting to think it had never happened. Elias just smiled. Took a while. Better late than never. The night before the drive, Elias couldn't sleep. He stood outside the cabin, looking at the stars, thinking about everything that could go wrong. The route was dangerous, the weather unpredictable, the markets volatile. One mistake could cost them everything. Clara came out and stood beside him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Can't sleep either, she asked. Too much on my mind. We're going to be fine. You don't know that. No, but I believe it. And right now, that's enough. Elias pulled her close, and she tucked herself against his side. They stood like that for a long time, two people who'd found each other in the middle of nowhere, betting everything on one last chance. Whatever happens, Elias said quietly, I'm glad I did this with you. Clara looked up at him. We haven't done it yet. I know, but still. She kissed him softly. Save the sentimentality for after we succeed. Right now, we have work to do. Yes, ma'am. They went back inside together, and this time when Clara climbed up to the loft, Elias followed. They lay together in the narrow bed, her head on his chest, his arms around her, and let the steady rhythm of each other's breathing chase away the fear. Tomorrow they'd start the drive. Tomorrow they'd risk everything. But tonight, they had this, and that was enough. They left at dawn with 38 head of cattle and 2 pack horses loaded with supplies. Dutch had offered to come along, but Elias turned him down. We need to do this ourselves, he'd said. Dutch had understood. Some things you had to face alone, even when alone meant 2 people instead of 1. The first day went smoothly. The cattle were cooperative, the weather held, and they made good time across the valley floor. By nightfall, they'd covered nearly 15 miles, setting up camp near a creek that still had decent water flow. Clara cooked beans and coffee over the fire while Elias checked the herd one final time. When he came back, she handed him a tin cup and sat down beside him. So far, so good, she said. Don't say that. You'll jinx it. You don't believe in jinxes. I'm starting to. She smiled and leaned against his shoulder. They ate in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to coals. In the distance, the cattle settled for the night, their breathing a steady rhythm in the darkness. You scared? Clara asked after a while. Terrified. Good. Me too. Elias looked at her. That's supposed to make me feel better? No, just honest. They took turns keeping watch that night. Elias took the first shift, walking the perimeter of the camp, listening for anything unusual. Wolves, rustlers, spooked cattle. Any of it could end the drive before it really started. But the night stayed quiet, and when Clara relieved him at midnight, he actually managed to sleep. The second day was harder. They hit rougher terrain, and one of the steers went lame halfway through the morning. Elias had to make the call. We can't slow down for it, he said. Clara looked at the limping animal. So we just leave it? Or put it down? Either way, we can't bring it to market. She was quiet for a moment, then she nodded. Put it down. At least it's quick. Elias took care of it while Clara kept the herd moving. When he caught up an hour later, she didn't ask about it, and he didn't offer details. Some things didn't need to be said. They lost another steer on the third day when it tried to cross a rocky slope and fell, breaking its leg. Same decision, same outcome. They were down to 36 head now, and every loss made the math tighter. We need $40 a head minimum now, Clara said that night, recalculating. No room for error. I know. What if the price is lower? Then we negotiate, or we walk away and try again next year. We don't have next year. The bank... I know, Clara. She fell silent, and Elias immediately regretted his sharp tone. He reached for her hand. We'll figure it out, he said more gently. We always do. She squeezed his fingers but didn't respond, because they both knew that luck only stretched so far, and they'd been riding it hard for months. The fourth day brought the river crossing. It was wider than Elias remembered, swollen from recent rains upstream, moving fast enough to be dangerous. They stood on the bank for 20 minutes, studying the current, looking for the safest route. There, Clara said, pointing to a spot where the riverbed looked shallower. The water's clearer, less deep. Current's still strong. Everywhere's going to be strong. This is our best option. Elias trusted her judgment. They'd done this before, and she'd been right then. He rode in first, feeling the horse tense as the water rose to its chest. The current pulled hard, trying to sweep them downstream, but he kept the horse angled upstream and made it across. Clara started the cattle moving. The first group went in hesitantly, but once they saw Elias on the other side, they followed. One by one, the cattle crossed, struggling against the current but making it. Then one of the younger steers panicked. It thrashed, lost its footing, and went under. Clara immediately rode toward it, her horse plunging into the deeper water. Elias's heart stopped. Clara, let it go! But she was already reaching for the steer, grabbing at its halter, trying to pull its head above water. Her horse stumbled, and for a terrible moment Elias thought they'd both go under. Then the horse found its footing, Clara got the steer's head up, and together they made it to the far bank. The steer collapsed on the shore, coughing water, but alive. Clara dismounted, breathing hard, soaked to the skin. Elias rode over fast. "What the hell were you thinking? We can't afford to lose another one. You could have drowned." "But I didn't." "Clara, don't." She looked at him, her eyes fierce. "We need every animal we can get to market. You know that. I wasn't going to just watch it die." Elias wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that no steer was worth her life, but he could see the determination in her face, the same stubbornness that had saved the valley from fire. She'd made her choice and owned it. "Next time, let me do it," he said finally. "Next time, we both do it." They got the rest of the herd across without incident and made camp on the far bank. Clara changed into dry clothes while Elias got a fire going. When she came back, he pulled her close without a word, just needing to feel that she was solid and real and still here. "I'm fine," she said against his chest. "I know. Just let me have this." She wrapped her arms around him. "Okay." They reached the stockyards outside Helena on the 6th day, exhausted and filthy, but with 36 head of cattle intact. The place was chaos, ranchers from all over the territory bringing in livestock, buyers moving between pens evaluating animals. The constant noise of cattle and horses and shouted negotiations. Elias found the livestock agent, a man named Patterson, who he'd dealt with before. Patterson looked at their herd with a critical eye, walking the fence line, checking teeth and weight. "They're lean," he said finally. "Drought year," Elias replied. "Everyone's lean. Market's soft right now. A lot of supply, not enough buyers." Clara stepped forward. "What are you offering?" Patterson glanced at her, surprised, then back to Elias. "I'll give you 32 a head." "That's insulting," Clara said before Elias could respond. "These are quality animals. We both know it. Quality or not, that's the market." "Then we'll find another buyer." Patterson smiled, not kindly. "You can try, but everyone's saying the same thing. 32 is fair." Elias felt his stomach drop. 32 a head meant they'd come up $400 short. Might as well have stayed home. But Clara wasn't done. "We drove these cattle 6 days through rough country. Lost only 2 animals, and those to accidents, not poor management. The herd is healthy, well-maintained, and ready for immediate transport. 32 doesn't reflect that value." "Value doesn't matter when supply exceeds demand." "Then we'll wait for demand to catch up. We're not selling for less than 40. Patterson laughed outright. "Wait, where? You planning to board them here? That'll cost you $3 a head per week. And if the market drops further, you'll be out even more." Clara didn't flinch. "We'll take that risk." "Clara," Elias said quietly, "maybe we should—" "No." She looked at Patterson. $40 a head, or we walk." Patterson studied her for a long moment. Then he shrugged. "Your funeral. Check back in a week. Maybe the market shifts. Maybe it doesn't." After he left, Elias turned to Clara. "What are we doing? We can't afford to wait a week." "We can't afford to sell at 32 either. We'd lose the ranch anyway." "At least we'd have some money. Waiting could leave us with nothing. Or it could get us what we need." Clara met his eyes. "I know it's a gamble, but sometimes you have to bet on yourself." Elias wanted to argue. Wanted to take the safe option, the guaranteed payout, even if it wasn't enough. But he looked at Clara's face, determined, unafraid, refusing to back down, and realized she was right. They'd come too far to settle for failure disguised as safety. "All right," he said. "We wait." They found cheap lodging in Helena, a boarding house that charged 50 cents a night for a room barely big enough for the narrow bed and a washstand. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and after 6 days on the trail, even a thin mattress felt like luxury. The first few days, they checked the stockyards twice daily. The market stayed flat. Prices hovered between $30 and $33 per head. Every buyer they talked to said the same thing: soft market, too much supply, take what you can get. By the 4th day, Elias was starting to panic. "We're running out of time," he said, pacing the tiny room. "And money. We can't stay here much longer." Clara sat on the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "Then we make something happen." "How?" "I don't know yet. Let me think." She went out that afternoon and didn't come back until evening. When she did, she had news. "There's a buyer coming in from Chicago," she said. "Railroad's expanding their beef contracts. He's looking for quality stock in bulk. Everyone's going to go after that contract. Not everyone has what he needs. I talked to the livestock office. He wants healthy animals, reliable sellers, and he's willing to pay premium prices for guaranteed delivery. Elias sat down beside her. How do you know all this? I asked questions, listened, talked to people. She smiled slightly. Turns out being a woman in a stockyard makes you invisible. People talk around you like you're not there. You learn things. And you think we have a shot at this contract? I think we have the best herd in the yards right now. 36 head, all healthy, all accounted for. If we can get in front of this buyer, show him what we have, we might actually pull this off. The Chicago buyer's name was Hutchins, and he arrived 3 days later with an entourage of assistants and paperwork. He was a big man, well-dressed, with the air of someone used to getting what he wanted. Elias and Clara positioned themselves near the main office, waiting for their chance. When Hutchins emerged after meeting with Patterson, Clara stepped forward. Mr. Hutchins, I'm Clara Voss. This is my husband Elias. We'd like a moment of your time. Hutchins looked at her with mild curiosity. I'm quite busy, Mrs. Voss. I understand, but we have 36 head of quality cattle that match exactly what you're looking for. 5 minutes is all we need. Something in her tone made him pause. 5 minutes. Make it count. They walked him to the pens where their herd was being held. Hutchins examined the cattle with a practiced eye, checking weight, condition, overall health. Elias held his breath. Finally, Hutchins straightened up. They're good animals. Better than most I've seen here. We can deliver them anywhere you need, Clara said. On time, in the condition you see now. What are you asking? $45 a head. Hutchins raised an eyebrow. That's high. That's fair for the quality you're getting. He considered it. I'll give you 42. Clara didn't hesitate. 44. 43, and I need delivery in Denver within 2 weeks. Elias did the math in his head. $43 times 36 head was $1,548, more than enough to pay off the bank and have money left over. Clara extended her hand. Deal! Hutchins shook it. I'll have my people draw up the contract. You deliver on time, you'll get your money. After he left, Elias turned to Clara. Denver's another week's drive minimum. I know. We'll barely make it. Then we'd better get started. They collected the herd that afternoon and started south toward Denver. The drive was punishing. Long days, short nights, constant pressure to keep moving. But the cattle were in good shape, the weather cooperated, and somehow they made it with 2 days to spare. The handoff went smoothly. Hutchins' people counted the herd, verified the condition, and paid in cash. Elias stood there with $1,548 in his hands, hardly believing it was real. We did it, Clara said quietly. Yeah, we did. They stayed in Denver one night, got a proper hotel room with hot water and clean sheets. Elias expected to celebrate, to feel relief, but instead he just felt numb. Exhausted beyond words, wrung out from months of constant pressure. Clara seemed to feel the same. They lay in bed together, neither speaking, just holding each other in the dark. What happens now? She asked eventually. We go home, pay off the bank, figure out what comes next. You think it'll be easier now? No, but maybe it'll be different. She kissed his shoulder. Different works. They made it back to Blackstone Valley in late October, just as the first snow was starting to fall. The ranch looked exactly as they'd left it, small, weathered, stubbornly standing against the Montana landscape. Dutch was waiting for them, having kept an eye on the property while they were gone. He grinned when he saw them ride up. You made it, he said. Heard you got the Chicago contract. Whole valley's talking about it. News travels fast, Elias said. Clara Voss outbargains a Chicago buyer. That's the kind of story people repeat. He looked at them both. You did good. Both of you. After he left, Elias and Clara stood in the yard looking at their cabin. It felt different somehow. Smaller, but also more solid. Like coming home after being gone too long. Ready to do this all over again next year? Clara asked. Elias pulled her close. Not even a little bit. Good. Me neither. They went inside, started a fire, and sat together in the warmth. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in white. Inside, they were finally still. The next morning, Elias rode to Helena and paid off the bank loan in full. The clerk who processed the payment looked shocked. Didn't think we'd see you again, he admitted. Most ranchers in your situation don't make it. We're not most ranchers. Back at the ranch, things settled into a new rhythm. They still worked hard. That would never change. But the desperation was gone. They weren't scrambling to survive anymore. They were building something. Clara expanded her garden, planted fruit trees that wouldn't bear for years, but showed faith in a future she planned to be part of. Elias repaired the cabin properly, replacing rotted boards and fixing the roof so it didn't leak. They bought 3 new heifers to rebuild the herd, paid in cash. Word spread about what they'd accomplished. Other ranchers started asking Clara for advice about land management, about negotiating with buyers, about the fire break technique she'd used. She became something of a legend in Blackstone Valley, the Eastern woman who'd saved everyone from destruction. Elias just smiled when people talked about it, because he knew the truth. Clara hadn't saved the valley. She'd saved him. Winter came in full force by November. But this time, when the snow piled high and the temperature dropped, Elias didn't feel the familiar dread. Clara played her violin in the evenings, filling the cabin with music. They cooked together, planned for spring, talked about the future in ways that assumed they'd both be there to see it. One night in December, almost a year since Clara had first arrived, they sat by the fire after dinner. Clara had her head on Elias's shoulder, his arm around her waist. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Sending that advertisement? Every day?" She lifted her head, surprised. "What?" "I regret not doing it sooner. Could have saved myself a few years of being miserable alone." Clara laughed and settled back against him. "You're getting better at this." "At what?" "Saying what you mean. Learn from the best." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Clara spoke again. "I'm pregnant." Elias went completely still. "What?" "I'm pregnant. About 2 months, I think. Wasn't sure at first, but now I am." 1,000 thoughts hit him at once. Fear, joy, panic, hope. All of it crashing together until he couldn't separate one feeling from another. He thought about Sarah, about the baby that never was, about everything he'd lost. And then he looked at Clara, solid and real and here, and realized this wasn't the past. This was something new. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Terrified, but okay." "Me too." Clara took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "We're going to be parents." "Yeah, we are. You ready for that?" Elias thought about it. Thought about everything they'd survived. The drought, the fire, the cattle drive, all of it. Thought about what Clara had taught him, about trusting people, about fighting for what mattered instead of just enduring. "No," he said honestly. "But I want to try anyway." Clara kissed him. Good answer. Spring came eventually, the way it always did in Montana. Late and reluctant, but inevitable. The snow melted, the grass returned, and the valley came back to life. Clara's pregnancy progressed without complications. She kept working well into her 3rd trimester, refusing to slow down until Elias practically forced her to rest. Even then, she found ways to contribute. Planning, organizing, making lists for everything they'd need once the baby came. The baby arrived in early June, a girl with dark hair and lungs that could wake the entire valley. They named her Sarah, after Elias's first wife, and May for Clara's mother. Sarah May Voss. Dutch was the first visitor, bringing a hand-carved cradle he'd made himself. "Figured you could use this," he said gruffly. Other neighbors came too, bringing food and supplies and congratulations. The same people who doubted Clara when she first arrived now treated her like family, because she'd proven herself 100 times over, and this valley took care of its own. Elias stood in the doorway of the cabin one evening, watching Clara rock their daughter by the firelight. She was singing something soft, a lullaby in German that her mother had taught her. The scene was so ordinary, so domestic, so different from the life he'd imagined for himself. And it was perfect. Not because it was easy or smooth or without problems, but because it was real. Clara looked up and saw him watching. "What?" "Nothing, just thinking." "About?" "About how lucky I got." She smiled. "We both did." Elias walked over and sat beside them, looking down at his daughter's face. Sarah May was sleeping now, peaceful and small and completely dependent on them to figure things out. "You think we can do this?" he asked. "Raise a kid? Probably not, but we'll try anyway." "That's your answer for everything." "It's worked so far." Years passed. Not easily, not smoothly, but they passed. The ranch prospered. They added more cattle, more land, built a bigger barn. Sarah May grew into a fierce little girl who climbed everything and asked too many questions and refused to take no for an answer. She was her mother's daughter. They had another child 3 years later, a boy they named Thomas after Elias's father. And then another girl 2 years after that, Elizabeth, who was quiet where Sarah was loud but just as stubborn underneath. The Voss Ranch became one of the strongest operations in the territory. Other ranchers came to Elias for advice. Clara taught farming techniques to anyone who'd listen. They weren't wealthy, weren't famous, but they were respected. They'd earned it. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the kids were asleep and the chores were done, Elias and Clara would sit on the porch and look out at the valley. The same brutal landscape that had tried to break them both. The same isolation that had made Elias write that advertisement in the first place. "You ever think about leaving?" Clara asked one night. It was the same question she'd asked years ago, but the answer was different now. "No," Elias said. "This is home." "Even with all the hard parts?" "Especially with those." Clara leaned against him, and Elias wrapped his arm around her shoulders. They sat like that until the stars came out, two people who'd found each other in the middle of nowhere and built something worth keeping. Because that was the thing about love in a place like this. It wasn't born from perfect circumstances or easy choices. It was forged through survival, through choosing each other every day, even when it was hard, through building something together that neither could have built alone. Elias had ordered a wife, expecting obedience and silence. Instead, he'd gotten a partner who challenged him, saved him, and changed everything he thought he knew about what a life could be. And Clara had crossed half a continent looking for a place where she could matter, where her strength wouldn't be wasted on trying to fit into someone else's idea of who she should be. They'd both found what they were looking for, not in the way they expected, but in the only way that mattered. They'd found each other. And in the harshest corners of the world, where nothing came easy and survival was never guaranteed, that was enough. That was everything.